She had learned to become good at small illusions, a sweep of concealer across the pale skin of her left cheek, a high collar to hide the fading bruise on her throat, a steady, neutral voice when the copier jammed, or when a client called to demand a contract by noon. Office hours taught you to move like glass clear, hard to crack, reflective enough to hide the fractures beneath. At 7:42 on a Tuesday morning, the fluorescent lights hummed over Moretti Industries' ninth-floor bullpen. The air smelled faintly of burnt coffee and lemon-scented disinfectant. Julia pinched a cotton pad, tamped on a sliver of foundation, until the purple shadow on her jaw softened into something the world wouldn't ask questions about. She watched numbers populate her screen and answered emails with the same calm politeness that had kept her employed through late nights and tight paychecks. The circled bruise only, she called it a bruise, sat under her collar like a secret battery, a dull ache that pulsed when she leaned back in her chair or when the fluorescent lights made everything feel too honest. She had learned to say nothing about him. Saying meant attention. Attention meant explanations. Explanations meant humiliation. So she kept her mouth closed and her hands busy. Then Joseph Moretti crossed her peripheral vision, and everything felt sharper. He moved with an economy reserved for people who had learned to measure every gestures, even shoes that scuffed the marble in perfect silence. His suits never wrinkled. His hair was a dark, careful thing. He wore an old-world cologne that smelled like cedar and expensive things, the kind of scent that left rooms ordered and quiet. When he walked past her desk, his eyes flicked in a way that made her hands stop mid-typing. He saw the edge of darkness in her skin, not like a man who was trying to make conversation, like a man who cataloged details, the slope of a shoulder, the way a sleeve lay, the cadence of someone keeping a secret. He did not ask, he merely paused. "You look tired," he said, and the words were small, harmless until they weren't. She had learned to let small lies slip. "Long night," she said. Her voice was even, but her heart clapped too loud in her chest. He watched her tinker with the concealer and, with the kind of small, precise movement he used for business cards, reached into his inner jacket pocket. He withdrew a leather card holder, slid out a single card with no flourish, and set it on her desk so the embossed letters caught the light. "J. Moretti, CEO. If you need anything," he said. No pretense of a smile, just an observation made and laid down as fact. "My assistant knows where I am." The world of Moretti Industries was full of promises in tiny type. He could have meant the card as a professional courtesy. He could have meant it as a warning. For someone who had learned to read, whether in the small signs of people's faces, his tone read like winter. She managed the smallest nod. "Thank you." He moved on without another word, his attention always calibrated to the room's center of mass. But his gaze lingered against a place where the bruise had been and did not find reason to leave. That afternoon, when she walked to the kitchen for water and leaned against stainless steel, she was suddenly aware of the bruise like a foreign country you had to cross in silence. When the phone on his desk rang later that morning, she heard the name before she heard the voice. Detective Martinez. The voice was closer to sand than silk, practical and thin. He was not the sort of man who made idle calls to the CEOs of town. He was the sort who rang when something didn't fit the neat boxers the police liked. "Joseph," he said quickly, "we have an odd report a missing person. I'm following up on leads. If you any chance, you could spare a moment. There may be a connection to your area. I don't want to alarm you, but—" Moretti listened the way a man listens to a conductor, measuring the beats, deciding which to accentuate and which to allow to die. He promised nothing, asked for nothing in return, then said, "Bring me anything you find." After the call, his face was unreadable, which was how he preferred it. He closed his office door and sent an email she would later glance at by mistake. Request discretion, inform only essential staff. The room, when she called him in, smelled cleaner than his usual cologne, the kind of sterile smell that belonged to boardrooms and bank vaults. He seated her across from his desk, light pooled cold on the marble. He had a manner of folding his hands that made people feel smaller, like they could be neatly contained between his fingers. "Do you live with someone?" he asked, not unkindly, as if he were asking about a roommate. She flinched. The small lie rose like a reflexive cough. Yes, she said. She didn't say his name. She never said his name. Moretti watched, his expression almost tender. Names help me be useful, he said. What's his? She told him. Evan Mitchell. Saying the name out loud felt like stepping into daylight. He asked questions the way a surveyor asks about the ground before he builds. Where does he work? When is he home? Does he lose his temper? Does he drink? The questions made her feel like a thing being examined. Useful. Yes, but inventoried. She answered without embellishment. Wherever she felt like hiding, she hid. There are different kinds of fear. There is the fear that spikes hot and immediate, the fear that tells you to run. There is the quiet fear that folds into you, becomes your bones, and keeps you from seeing the exits. Julia's fear lived in the second kind. She had memorized Evan's habits the way a survivor must memorize the tide schedule. He came on Thursdays angry. He apologized on Sundays with flowers she couldn't afford to accept. He drank when the red lights of the bar down on Lyell Avenue flickered, and then he came home with a voice that could get loud like storms. When Moretti told her, in the most careful voice he owned, that he would make inquiries, she found that instead of the relief she had hoped for, she felt a new, stranger thing. Being noticed, to be seen by someone who understood how to move pieces, was to submit to a current whose direction you didn't control. Is this? She began, and stopped, saying the rest would mean asking permission to be safe. It will be handled, he said. He chose his words as if trimming a hedge. Discretion, protection, no attention. The promise came with a price in the tone soft, but with undersides. He did not promise absolution, only his own intervention. If you lived long enough around people like Joseph Moretti, you'd learn their grammar. He used certain words like a tool. Protection, discretion, handled. They were not the vocabulary of the law. They were the vocabulary of arrangement. After she left his office, she sat at her desk and felt hollowed out like a notebook that had been read. Her coworkers walked past, arguing about deliverables, unaware of the quiet recalibration that had occurred in the air between her shoulders. She answered an email, scheduled a meeting, arranged a shipment. The world stayed polite and mechanical. If this had been a simpler story, the detective would have found evidence and the police would have done their work. But Julia had learned. From whispered warnings at the women's shelter and from the nighttime phone calls she had made to herself while cradling a sweater, that the law was not always a net for people like her. It could be slow and bureaucratic, and Evan's kind of violence thrived in the cracks. When she voiced the thought, even to herself, it sounded cowardly yet also true. Survival, she had learned, was not a clean thing. Hey, her friend Adele said that night when they met for coffee like an old ritual. Adele had eyes that took in too much and gave too little away, and she looked at Julia with the bluntness of a woman who had been too poor to be sentimental. You okay, Jules? Julia played the part. I'll be fine, she said, and the lie cinched her ribs like too tight fabric. She thought of Moretti's card in her wallet, heavy as an omen. After hours, the first of Moretti's men began to move. They were not men who yelled. They were men who arrived in town cars and sat in the hinterlands of observation. They took photographs where the light was honest. Evan's usual bar on Lyell Avenue, his bus stop on Radnor, the cheap gym where he lifted, then smoked, then left. They sent frames by secure channels. The images appeared like facts on a desktop. Evan with a coffee at 9:03 p.m., Evan coming out of a strip of late-night diner at 11:42 p.m., Evan in his pickup at 1:05 a.m. A rhythm built itself. Villain in a pattern, pattern to be read, pattern to be broken. Every photograph made Julia feel like a stranger in her own life. They were records of the man who hurt her, but also of a man she had once loved enough to forgive when his apologies smelled of beer and regret. She remembered the softness of his voice in the early months, the way he'd pressed his forehead to hers and promised a future that smelled of cheap wine and patchwork hope. Those were real memories, not the manufactured recollections that people sometimes cling to after heartbreak. They hurt because they were honest. One image in particular landed on her phone at 3:14 a.m. It was a grainy still of Evan, stepping out of his truck, behind the Donnelly warehouse. Time-stamped 1:41 a.m. The angle was flat, candid. He had his hands in his pockets and his head down. No one else. The frame captured the alley's wet pavement, the smear of a street lamp's halo. The world in the picture was the world Evan moved through, small, ordinary, suddenly fragile. She did not know whether to be grateful or horrified when Moretti's driver arrived that morning with a suitcase and the softest knock on her apartment door she had ever heard. They did not speak of it as an evacuation. They called it a brief change of address. An insurance policy. He handed her a card for a suite at the Halston Hotel 2 blocks from the river, with a view that swallowed the small city and left the horizon tidy, as if arranged for someone with taste. The Halston smelled like bergamot and clean linens. The suite was vast in a way that made the word vast, but light spread across imported rugs and furniture that had no reason to be in the life she had lived until last week. A tray held cold chicken and a small pot of mashed potatoes she did not have the appetite to touch. A robe hung on the back of a door, thick and expensive. The windows were large enough to make her feel like her life had been framed. It was loneliness dressed as safety. Rest, Moretti said the first night she spent there. He arrived with a thermos of soup and a blanket, the corners folded like an offering. He placed them on the small table by the sofa, as if setting down a chess piece. He moved close enough to see the small detail of her face, to notice the fading bruise, now almost fully concealed. He did not demand explanations. He asked, in a voice that could be a confession, "Do you want me to come with you back to your apartment and take what you need?" That offered presence felt dangerous. Presence from a man with Moretti's resources could mean security. It could also mean trade-offs she could not yet see. She shook her head and let her gaze slide to the window where the city breathed its indifferent hum. "I don't want you to do anything that," she started, but the words collapsed under the weight of gratitude and shame. "I won't make promises I can't keep," he told her. The same man who had told Detective Martinez that he would be helpful, "but I will make sure you are not hurt again." He spoke like a man stating a business term. She wanted to believe him, because herself believed little else. As the night lengthened, she lay on the sofa in the borrowed robe, the city lights reflecting off the glass, and thought about the way safety had been purchased for her without a receipt she could examine. She felt like someone who had been moved to a new house, while the thief who took her old life remained in the neighborhood. In the dim hours, Moretti sat at the foot of the sofa and asked her, very gently, how long it had been like this. He made no assumptions. He did not speak of consequences. He watched her closely, and for a moment she mistook his attention for empathy. It was empathy, wrapped in strategy on assessment. He learned things by listening, as if he were plotting a map, and she realized that whatever kindness she might feel could never be neat. There was a cost to being under the wing of a man who could solve things few men could. When she described the small violences, how Evan grabbed her wrist in public, how he spoke to her like she was air, she watched the way Moretti's hands tightened on the ceramic cup they had given him. He did not raise his voice. He did not promise retribution. He catalogued with a professional calm that made her feel like an item being invented. "Did he ever make threats?" he asked. "Not in front of people," she said. "He's smart about it." Moretti's eyes slipped closed for a single breath, as if tasting the word smart. Predators are often smarter than the systems meant to catch them. That is how they stay a step ahead. When he spoke next, he used the gentle pronouns of a man used to commanding obedience without force. "You will not be alone," he said. "You will have help. You will have somewhere safer, temporarily. There are means I can deploy that the police cannot. Understand me. I am not the law. I don't pretend to be. I'm practical." "Why?" The question came out small as a pinprick. Why would a man like him, so measured, so distant, suddenly become involved with the edges of her life? For a moment his gaze soft in a way that made her chest loosen. "Because I noticed," he said simply. "Because I don't like it. Not like it. Not justice. Not righteousness. Not duty, just a private dislike turned into intervention." The reasons mattered less to her than the fact of the protection. She found herself thanking him later in a way that startled her, because she could smell the guilt like a low, pasha stentoeku. In the days that followed, Moretti's people stitched a new reality around her. A driver met her at the back door of her building at odd hours, and took her to the Halston for days on end. Someone installed a different lock on the door to the hotel suite and registered everything under a corporate name that never appeared on a public ledger. Meals arrived on silver trays. There were men quiet efficient who took routes she couldn't memorize but who always arrived before Evan ever could. She found herself moving through a life bordered by marble and geometry instead of torn curtains and slammed doors. Meanwhile, the investigation that had been nothing more than an odd phone call became a slow film of details. Moretti's men trailed Evan for a week, mapping his habits, assembling his routine like a jigsaw puzzle. They didn't stalk, they documented. They took pictures, noted dates, logged times. They watched him buy cigarettes in the afternoon, then buy beer in the evening, then disappear into alleys where shadows collected like bad thoughts. Moretti showed her some of the footage once. He did not boast. He let the evidence speak. On a screen that hummed with light, frames clicked by. Evan at his truck, Evan outside the gym, Evan walking near the Donnelly warehouse with his shoulders drawn in against the night. The images were small and real. Watching him, Julia felt as if she were seeing the man she'd loved from the outside, like a photograph that could not capture the sound of his apologies or the specific way he said her name. When the detective called again, this time to say that Evan had been reported missing by a late-night clerk at the warehouse where he sometimes did small, unsteady labor, Moretti arranged a meeting. Detective Martinez came to the Halston with the kind of practicality he had used on the phone. He was official, in the way he was forced to be, the world of badges and forms dragging at his tone. There was a report filed last night, Martinez said, passing a thin envelope to Moretti. No witnesses who can corroborate much, but there's something odd. Cuts in the inventory log, a truck that left and didn't return. We'll follow up, but if you've got anything. Moretti folded the envelope with the precise, methodical care of a man folding a map. He set it next to a bowl of green apples on the marble table. I have people looking, he said. There are gaps in their story. For Julia, the word gaps felt like a hollow in her chest. She wanted the certainty of names, of a legal arrest that would take him away behind public bars and legal orders. But the world she knew, this private world of men in expensive suits and people who moved in shadow, offered something else. Removal, without fanfare. The idea made her stomach turn with a complicated nausea that tasted like relief and ash. One evening, as rain stitched the city into stripes of silver, Moretti asked her to join him in his office. He had a photograph on his desk, simple as a cigarette, card grainy, time-stamped, obvious. He slid it across the marble and did not let his hands tremble. Julia's breath hitched when she saw it. The photograph was of Evan, leaning against his truck behind the Donnelly warehouse. The night she had recognized him on her phone. Same jacket, same slouch. The time stopped. A quiet, terrible certainty. But the new photograph was different, not just because of its clarity, but because of what it implied. There was an absence in subsequent frames, the way there was silence between symbols. The camera that had followed Evan that night captured him walking into a corridor, and then the footage went dark. Not a gap in the recording, Moretti said later, an absolute stop. He met her eyes over the photograph without apology. He's gone, he said, and the sentence was a thing that landed and did not move. There was no flourish, no confession, no admission in words of how it had occurred. He spoke as if he were closing the ledger on a terrible item. It had been handled, purged, removed. The way he said it was crucial. He did not volunteer details the way a man trying to justify himself might. He spoke the fact into being. The implication sat in the room like the smell of his cologne. It was not a smell you mistook for something else. Did what happened? Her voice was small, brittle, with a child's hope that a different answer could rewrite everything. Moretti's gaze was steady, almost clinical. He said, "He won't be able to hurt you again." He let the sentence rest, like an offering on the marble. There was no boast in it, but there was an unmistakable ownership of the outcome. The implication that he and his men had ensured Evan would never come back was as plain as any spoken sentence, even if he had not said the word kill or the word. He used softer language, and left the edges sharp. Her relief was immediate, and raw, so immediate it made her feel ashamed. Relief was the first brash emotion. Guilt settled after, a slow and heavy thing. she thought of the hole his absence would leave not only in the world that had hurt her but in the bureaucracy that might seek him. She imagined a missing person form stuffed into a file drawer and closed. She pictured Detective Martinez's practical face and wondered whether he would ask more questions, whether the law would stumble on the edges where money and power operated. "You did this," she said finally, because the facts needed tethering to the truth she lived inside. He agreed without ceremony. "I made arrangements." The sentence hung between them like a curtain. She could have asked for details, for the names of those who had moved, for the moral accounting of what had been done in her name. She did not have the courage to ask. Part of that was fear of the ways the answer might bind her, but part was relief so sharp she could not breathe. "You didn't call the police?" she said, a smallness in her protest. "Police are useful in certain places," he said, "but the systems we have often move too slowly. I didn't want you to wait." He folded his hands again, shades of control wrapping around the room. "You're fortunate, you told me. Not everyone would be so straightforward." It was an odd kind of fortune, she thought, fortune with edges. She left his office that day feeling hollow and heavy with gratitude. The Holston suite felt less like a shelter and more like a harbor. The immediate storm was past, but the sea outside still roiled with unseen currents. She stood at the window and watched the city pull itself together. Traffic lights, taxis, the indifferent hum of people going about lives that did not concern themselves with the calculus of safety. That night, alone in the suite, she lay awake and tried to name what she felt without reflexively forgiving herself. The absence of Evan had a sound, silence, and a thin, cold relief. It was joy cut with the sharpness of something morally complicated. She remembered the way Moretti had said the words, "He won't be able to hurt you again," in the controlled way he'd slid the photograph across the marble. People talk about choices as if they are clean lines. She felt like she had been offered a lifeline tied to a rope whose other end was weighted with things she could not yet see. To accept safety from a man with Moretti's reach would mean to move into a life where threats were replaced by dependencies and favors remembered like debts. She thought of the future and the price tags it might carry. She washed the concealer from her face in the Holston bathroom and watched the bruise re-emerge in the steam like a small, stubborn geography. Washing it away didn't erase the memory. She thought of the small rituals she had practiced for years, breathing slowly, rubbing a warm towel against her cheek, pretending to forget things that could not be forgotten. Days passed and a pattern established itself. Food on silver trays, a driver at the door, a nightly check-in from a man whose hands could shape outcomes in a way ordinary people could not. Moretti's presence was not intrusive. He moved with the reserve of someone who knew the difference between possession and partnership. There were moments of kindness that felt Rial's hand on the small of her back as he escorted her down the hotel corridor. A bouquet of wildflowers left on the coffee table with no note. There were moments that felt like levered the soft way he asked her to sign an agreement for employment under his company, as if protection could be translated into contract. She had, in the back of her mind, the small hope that perhaps the world he offered would be clean. That was naive. The world he moved through was a gilded mesh of favors, debts, silences. To be sheltered by that world meant to accept its rules. She found herself thinking of Evan in the most prosaic ways. The way he liked his coffee too bitter. The way he left mismatched socks on the floor. The way he had once promised to call in the week they had shared a foolish, hopeful apartment. Those small domestic images were sharp now in their familiarity, but they did not undo the nights when fear had been a physical presence, when she had counted the seconds between slaps and silence. Memory was not a single voice. It was a chorus of the best and the worst. One afternoon, Moretti invited her for lunch in a small, private restaurant tucked below his office building. It was the kind of place where noise was soft and the waiters knew when to leave a silence between plates. Over salad that tasted of lemon and salt, he spoke in a tone that made business of things she felt like apologizing for. The fact that she had been hurt, her need for care, the decision she had to make about where she would go next. "Safety costs," he said frankly, "not in currency you can see on a statement, but in terms of what the world will expect of you." "What does the world expect?" she asked. Her voice was steadier than she felt. He watched her as a man watches a fragile object being turned in his hands. Gratitude, he said. Silence. Loyalty. It was the vocabulary of containment again, gentle but precise. He did not demand immediate answers, only the recognition that any arrangement had consequences. She surprised herself by asking a question that was not about survival but about honesty. Did you tell anyone, Detective Martinez? The police? He tapped the table, a small, considered movement. I spoke to Martinez, he said. I gave him what I had. He's doing what he can. There are things outside his purview. She wanted to ask him the one question that had been circling her like a bird. Did he personally ensure that Evan would not return? Instead, she asked, a softer delivery. Did he suffer? Moretti's face did not betray him. He answered in the same way he had answered the other dangerous questions, with a translation into the language of results. He's not coming back. That is what matters. She felt a surge that, ugly, overwhelming, relief and immediately, a revulsion at herself for feeling grateful. It was easy to imagine those two emotions, relief and guilt, shaped like a pair of conjoined twins tugging at her ribs. People will ask questions, Moretti added quietly, as if the thought had only just occurred to him now. It won't be neat. It won't look like a perfect solution. There will be gaps. There will be consequences. So why help me? She had to ask it. The question was a splinter she could not loosen with silence. He set down his fork and looked at her with an almost disarmingly human softness. Because I noticed you, he said simply. Because I don't like certain things I see in the world. Because, perhaps, I find it difficult to watch harm without intervening. The answer did not satisfy her. It offered no clean morality, but it gave us something more dangerous. A truth that was not simple, and therefore not comfortable. She had been saved from a man who could harm her. Yes, but she had been saved by means that were messy and morally compromised. In the slow arc of those days, she began to see the edges of the life being offered by Moretti. There were invitations phrased as necessities, a suggestion. She considered a position as personal. Assistant to someone in his circle, a private apartment, in a building he owned. Small, steady pay. The offer was practical and tempting. It promised a life squared away in ways she'd never known. Safety, a steady income, distance from Evan, and there was tenderness, too. It arrived in small, unexpected gestures, a sweater left folded over the back of a chair, a quiet message at odd hours asking if she'd slept. He spoke to her with a courtesy that felt foreign and yet welcome. His touches were never hurried. They were measured, as if he were calibrating a response for a fragile instrument. Still, the big moral questions hovered like unfinished conversations. If someone vanished from the world because a man like Moretti decided it was necessary, what did that mean about the world she had joined allegedly to be safe? Could gratefulness exist without complicity? Was love that grew out of gratitude tainted at the root? She tried to answer these questions by making practical lists, things she must do to feel safe, people she could call if she needed help, papers to gather, but the lists were small scaffolds over wide, unsteady ground. One night, as rain made keys in the city glint like sequins, she found herself on the Halston balcony, the city, a grid of indifferent light below. She held the photograph Moretti had given her, the time-stamped frame of Evan, and traced the lines of his jacket with a thumb that still trembled with memory. "You took him away," she said aloud to the cool air, hearing the accusation in her own voice. There was no answer but the city noise and an exhale of her own breath. You did not have to be religious to pray. Sometimes people prayed to whatever God showed up, in the form of a man who offered safety. That night she whispered words that were part gratitude, part accusation, part a plea for a future that might not require such bargains. She thought of Detective Martinez, of the thin envelope he'd handed over, of the formal machinery that could demand accountability. She thought, too, of the men who had trailed Evan like ghosts until he fell out of sight. She imagined their hands, the conversations that must have happened in quiet rooms with legal apathy and the kind of efficiency that leaves no paper trail. There are lives that end with a headline, legal process, and a trial. There are lives that vanish with no notice, folded like a letter and placed under the weight of a ledger. Julia's mind danced in the space between the two, trying to find a shape for what she had been given. When she returned to the suite, she found Moretti there, waiting. Not with the impatience of a suitor, but the patient posture of a man who had set a chessboard. The photograph lay on the coffee table like a small island of truth. He drank his tea without haste, watched her without forcing conversation. "People will say things," he said after a moment. "They will speculate. I would like you to be prepared for how that feels." She sat in the armchair and let his words settle. "Prepared for what?" "For questions," he said. "For the curiosity of people who don't know what they would do in your place. For the loneliness you might feel when you realize safety sometimes arrives with strings." "You mean consequences," she said. "Consequences," he agreed. The agreement was simple and absolute, neither apologetic nor celebratory. "If you decide to stay within my protection, you will live with a certain dependency. If you choose to leave, if you go to the authorities and demand public action, there may be further risk." Her heart did an odd, involuntary flip. He did not counsel a specific path. He laid out options like cards on a table and left the decision to her. "Will you?" Her voice faltered, searching for the right question. "Will you be in my life beyond this? I mean, if I say I want protection, is that a long-term thing?" He considered the question. "I can offer you security," he said. "A job, housing, a life where you are less likely to be afraid. That is what I can guarantee." People romanticize decisions like hers, as if it was an instant union of two souls under the glow of destiny. In reality, it felt like any other negotiation. Pros and cons, backs pressed to the wall, the calculus of safety, a blunt implement. Julia weighed the idea of a life without fear against the cost of being beholden to a man whose solutions were outside the jurisdiction of law. "What will you expect of me?" she asked. "Honesty," he said softly. "And discretion. I will not ask anything that betrays your dignity. I will expect you to be candid about what is happening around you. The rest we can define together." She thought of the shape of such an existence, a life in which a man with power offered sanctuary in return for the quiet seam of loyalty. The trade-off was dangerous to consider, but the alternative, moving back into an apartment where nights were uncertain, was a danger she had already experienced and did not want to repeat. She found herself asking, late into that evening, whether the price of safety was to be loved in a way she would someday find complicated. Could gratitude morph into genuine affection? Could she love a man who could erase another woman's abuser with the same hand that offered her flowers? Those questions would have to be answered later, she realized. For now, the immediate arithmetic, safety versus exposure, was too pressing. As the Halstons' lights dimmed and the city made its habitual surrender to night, she lay in bed and watched the dark gather. She felt like a person on the threshold of a life being quietly reconfigured. The photograph on the coffee table, Evan in the alley. The time stomp, like a wound, stared up at her like an accusation or an absolution. She could not decide which. Outside, the city breathed on, indifferent and tireless. Inside, she was a woman offered an impossible gift and a terrible cost. The days ahead had contours she could not yet sketch. There would be decisions to make. There would be questions from people who had not been in her shoes. There would be a future that might close one door but open others, some gilded and some shadowed. When she finally slept, it was the sleep of someone who had been exiled from a familiar geography and placed in foreign country. She dreamed of light hitting the edge of a marble desk, and of a hand sliding a photograph across it, and woke with the weight of the photograph's implication heavy in her palm, the way a promise can be heavy when you cannot see all the clauses. The morning after the photograph slid across the marble, Detective Martinez called yet again. His voice on the line was less procedural than before. Curiosity had hardened into a focused interest. "We have a missing person file," he said, "and a few anomalies. I don't want to make assumptions, but if you know anything Adele, call me." Julia looked at Moretti's card in her wallet and at the Halston key card on the counter and felt the world split into two lanes. One where the public record had pads and processes, and another where a private man with private methods cleared the roads by his own means. Which lane did she choose? Which lane would keep her safe? She answered Detective Martinez in measured words, telling him the truth of what she could without giving herself away. Yes, she could confirm details. Yes, she would share what she knew. But little of investigational value existed beyond the small specifics of Evan's habits. After the call, Moretti sat in the suite's dark and mentioned, quietly, a thing he had not yet said aloud. People like Victor Koff notice when things in their network go missing. The name was small, like the warning of a distant bell. The city had pockets of men whose names carried weight, people whose interests were not fortified by legality but by leverage. The mention of Victor Koff was a reminder that the removal of one man from the neighborhood's pattern could ripple outward. The name Victor Koff settled in the room like a new temperature, slow and telling. Moretti had said it almost casually, as if dropping a footnote into a contract. For Julia, it sounded like a storm warning given in code. "You know him?" she asked. Because questions were small things she could still control. Moretti watched her over the rim of his cup. The marble between them kept its cool. "He runs a ring," he said. "Small time at the edges, but dangerous in the way people with few scruples can be. If someone disappears from the neighborhood, names get traded." She traced the photograph's edges with the pad of her thumb until the paper softened. The time stamp blurred where her fingertip had warmed it. "Is he connected to Evan?" "Indirectly," Moretti said. "People like Victor buy off pieces of a puzzle. He doesn't usually make a habit of removing problems personally, but he notices when his supply chain changes. He notices missing wages, missing men, missing debts. He asks questions, and questions breed complications." Complications was an understatement. To Julia, complications meant risk. Risk meant the hosting could feel suddenly like a thin curtain between a calm room and weather that would not be polite. "You could keep me here forever," she said, half a dare, half a child's pleading. Moretti's mouth tilted once. Not quite a smile. "I cannot make the world forget, Julia. I can reduce the likelihood of you being harmed in the way you were harmed. I can arrange for a life that has fewer late nights walking down bad streets. I can create conditions that look like a life, but I cannot make legal consequences if there are any disappear." He chose the words as if folding a map. "There will be other pressures, other men who will ask where something disappeared to. People like Victor don't always accept silence. They make inquiries. Sometimes they use blunt instruments." Her throat tightened. The bluntness in his language was the only honesty she had heard in weeks. She had expected pseudo-reassurances, technicalities and platitudes from people who lived in comfortable, law-befriended bubbles. Moretti's language, by contrast, felt like being handed a tool and an instruction manual that had parts missing. "Is Detective Martinez?" She stopped, and then finished the thought in the smallest voice she had used in months. "Is he enough?" Moretti considered that. "He will do police work the way the police do it," he said. "Respectable. Proper. Limited. He will look for forensic traces, witness statements, things that belong in the public file. He is not specialized for what follows when networks start to close ranks. He cannot always promise safety for your nightly walk home. That is not his jurisdiction." It was a tacit admission. The authorities could try. But for people like Julia, justice ran on timetables that could be interrupted by the brutal arithmetic of those who operated off-book. She spent the next days in a new rhythm. The Holston suite became a place of small comforts and practiced separations. She learned the names of the men who collected garbage at odd hours and the drivers who made sure she never saw a street corner alone. She accepted a position at first, temporary, managed under Moretti's corporate umbrella, ostensibly to keep her occupied and financially stable while formalities settled. The contract arrived like ink on velvet. A simple letterhead, an employment clause that read as protection and as tether. Moretti asked her to look it over with an honest, far-seeing patience that made her feel both childish and honored. There was a clause he insisted on, one he framed as mutual care. "Honesty and transparency," he said when she asked why. "I will expect you to tell me immediately of anything that concerns you. You will have to be candid about people who contact you. In exchange, I will not intrude where your dignity must remain whole. There will be no humiliations." She signed because it felt safer than not signing. Signing was a practical act, a line that turned a wavering possibility into a building with address and an entry code. It also felt, in a way she wanted to hate herself for, like signing for kindness. The small mercies arrived in the shape of daily routines: an assistant who took her schedules, a driver who parked a block away and walked her to the building's vestibule in the late afternoon, a desk that belonged to someone else before it began to belong to her. Moretti's world was ordered. His men were quiet. His city was arranged the way a watchmaker arranges gears, each in its place and ready to claim time. The initial relief eased into a domesticity that felt like a careful experiment. She had never known a life where someone brought soup without asking for something in return. It was disorienting and slowly warming. Moretti's gestures of care were small and measured dextra blankets, a hand on the small of her back in a hallway. The way he always noticed when she wore a color he liked. Tenderness, she realized, could arrive in the language of attentiveness. He did not grandstand. There were no dramatic declarations. He asked how she slept. He sat quietly while she read aloud a passage from a book she liked, not because he loved the literature, but because he could imagine a life where her voice did not prick at the air with fear. Months accumulated like coins in a jar. They learned each other's rhythms, not in the romantic montage one saw in movies, but in the careful mapping of needs and limits. She learned the precise way he chose his words when he did not want to give orders. He learned how to silence the reflex in her to apologize for existing. There were dinners where conversation took on the texture of ordinary life. Talk of a film, a debate on a news item, a comment about a friend's child. He could be unexpectedly ordinary in the company of a city that never let itself be entirely ordinary. Still, the photograph on the coffee table existed like an artifact no one wanted to put away. It was a ghost in a room arranged for the living. Then, Viktorkov showed his teeth. It began small. A note slid under the Holston door that morning, written in a shaky hand on poor paper. The words were not threats. They were inquiries. Where did Evan go? Who benefited from the disappearance? Such notes were not meant to frighten for the thrill. They were mechanisms of leverage. Victor wanted to know two things: whether someone had taken a pawn that belonged to him, and if so, whether payment or reprisal might follow. Moretti read the note, folding it in the light like he might fold a map. He did not curse. He did not storm. He made a call, and within hours, a different set of mendicanti who smelled faintly of street leather and cold coffee were circling the edges of Julia's world in ways that made the city feel smaller and more dangerous. A message came soon after, more direct. A middleman turned up at a diner 2 blocks from Moretti's office and left a man alone with a waitress who had only to hand over a paper napkin. The napkin contained a single line: "You fix this price to pay?" It was an economic question posed in the currency of fear and advantage. Moretti told her as little as needed, which was more than most men in his position had ever said to someone in her place. "They ask questions when supply lines dry up," he repeated. "They want to know where a product went, where a debtor vanished. Victor's people ask in ways that are not subtle." Julia sat with the words and tried to name the feeling that rose in her throat. It was not the old fear exactly. It was a steadier, longer shadow, an understanding that whatever shelter she had been given came with an imprinted target she could not wash away. "You could make me disappear," she said one night, testing the phrase as if it were an unfamiliar bird that might fly away if she spoke its name. Moretti's hand hovered over the table, an unlit match. "I can offer options," he said. "I can create a relocating life in a jurisdiction where they do not know you. I can make papers. I can introduce you as another person, or I can stand between you and those who would pry. Both have costs. Both require surrendering things." She thought of vanishing. The idea had a bright, immediate appeal. A new name. A rental in a town she'd never seen. A life where mornings were not accompanied by the taste of adrenaline. But vanishing also meant cutting her past away like a limb. It meant Detective Martinez's questions unanswered. An absence that would never be explained. A trail that would amount to no one to speak her name. It meant abandoning the thread of truth she had in her chest. "Disappear or stay," Moretti said quietly. He laid out the brutality of the choice, without drama. "Disappear and we protect the logistics, no questions asked, but you will be removed from this life. Stay, and we defend you openly, less of a guarantee that no one will ever look your way. More assurance that there will be someone between you and them. The present options were more nuanced than his framing. There were shades between disappearance and direct protection, cryptic relocations, staged business trips, layered identities, but each had a cost. Disappearing required cutting ties and accepting an anonymity that could be both peace and prison. Staying meant living under the constant potential of being a bargaining chip. She had not expected to choose quickly. Decisions like that belonged in a calendar with notes, not in the brittle hush of a hotel suite. But fear could also sharpen decisions into absurd clarity. She felt the old muscle reflex of survival-y part of her that had learned to count details of his mood lean into the calculus. Would you be safe if I disappeared? She asked finally, as if safety were a simple guarantee he could write in a ledger. If you disappear properly, he said, it makes it harder for someone like Victor to find leverage. But you lose other things? Your past? Your right to testify? Your name? It is not freedom. It is exile. She pictured herself in a smaller town, working under an assumed name. She saw a life of small satisfactions and the ache of never being able to answer the door and tell the truth. She imagined Detective Martinez continuing his work in the city and never knowing who to pin the missing person report on. It was a life of safety, wrapped in the loneliness of erasure. What about? She hesitated. What about going public? Going to the papers? Making a story? Maybe put pressure on criminal networks. Moretti's laugh was soft, not mocking but tired. Publicity invites chaos in different forms, he said. It invites people who will look, yes, but it invites people who profit from spectacle. It can make you a symbol rather than a person. He looked at her as if to say, you would be doing this for the world, not yourself. I am pragmatic. The choices I offer are those that reduce immediate risk. It was an ugly honesty that felt almost reverent. He did not press her. He laid out facts like cards and let her choose. She thought of Adele's blunt eyes and the women at the shelter and the nights she had spent on the phone whispering herself into sleep. She thought of the carving out of self that came from never speaking his name. She weighed the cost of silence against the ache of living with constant vigilance. In the end, she found herself choosing the life that kept her rooted. She decided she would not give herself up to erasure. She would not step into a different name to buy a half-life of peace. She would stay and let Moretti fight whatever came for her. It was not a moral triumph. It was a human one. She wanted to keep the thread of her past, flawed and ragged as it was. I'll stay, she said, and her voice surprised her with its steadiness. If we do this, I stay. But I need to know what you expect. I need to know what I'm signing my life into. He nodded, relief softening his face for a moment. Honesty, he said again. You will tell me when people arrive. You will avoid riskier routes at night. You will let us manage certain things, and I will not ask you to perform favors beneath your dignity. She demanded one more thing. If there is ever a way I'd leave, a real exit, would you help then? He made a small sound she could not interpret, and then he said, if an exit is possible without endangering you, I will arrange it, but exits are not always clean. They take resources and risk. The agreement felt like a contract written in breath. She left the room that day with a hand that trembled less than it had on the morning she first drew concealer across a bruise. The tremor was there, but smaller. Little by little, the Holston suite felt less like temporary refuge and more like a carefully guarded room inside a larger fortress whose walls were made of men who knew how to move in shadows. They began to make the fortress practical. Cameras, new locks, alternate routes to work tricks. Moretti's men executed with professional silence. She moved into a modest apartment Moretti owned after 2 weeks. A place with high windows and a kitchen that would never belong to her mother's tight budget, but now did. She took a role that gave her a reason to leave in the daytime and return at night. She took the city in steps that kept her from panic. Meanwhile, months folded into the sort of quiet domesticity that sometimes disguises the depth of a relationship. There were dinners that tasted of lemons and careful questions about trivial things. They read to each other. There were nights when Moretti would sit on the floor and play a piano he rarely spoke of, and Julia would listen, the notes of his hands warm as a confession. He was a man of compartmentalized kindness, one who understood that love could be worked into a schedule between meetings and negotiations. Their intimacy grew not by brute force, but by a steady accrual of small mercies. There were mornings where he would bring coffee and set it on the table the way he set down decisive documents, with quiet respect. There were nights when she would find a sweater left on a chair, with the faint scent of cedar and soap, and realize, with a peculiar surprise, that she had been thought of in the interim. Her feelings shifted in ways that felt both inevitable and unauthorized. Part of her gratitude had the weight of survival. Part of it was simple and human: his manner, his attentiveness, the rare softness that flickered when he spoke of small, unimportant things. She found herself noticing the way his silence could hold an entire room, or how he would let a joke rest between them and then laugh at it like someone discovering joy anew. He quoted with precision and restraint, no theatrical gestures, only decisions that placed her at the center of his private life. He offered her a permanent role as his personal assistant in his downtown office, a job with benefits and a steady salary, and the unmistakable advantage of always being present in his orbit. He insisted not in command, but in invitation, that she move into the penthouse of a building he owned. It was a space of glass and warm wood, a place where light fell in a way that made her feel more seen and less raw. There she began to understand the contours of what love could be when it arrived from a man with power. It was complicated. It was real. It carried an undertow that tugged at the edges of what she had thought herself to be. "I don't want our life to be built on a ledger of favors," she told him one evening, when the city outside was a grid of moving lights and some small sirens knifed at a distance. She had been honest in payment for their shared table, and he had reciprocated with a glance that felt like confession. "I don't want to only be grateful." He placed his hand over hers on the coffee table. The contact was ordinary and enormous at once. "I don't expect gratitude alone," he said. "I want you because I like you. Not because you needed shelter. Because, at the end of things, I like you. I find your presence costly to be without." She felt the words, and they landed differently than any monetary language. There was a tenderness there, rough at the edges because it had been earned through trauma and rescue and the strange negotiations of power. Love, she decided, could be a knot of all those things: protection, affection, indebtedness, choice. Yet the city with its networks and ripples refused to stay quiet. One afternoon, Detective Martinez arrived at her office unannounced. He did not have the accusatory tone she had feared. He had instead the professional curiosity of a man trying to knit reality from loose threads. "We're still working the missing persons file," he said, sliding a thin envelope across her desk. "We have holes we can't fill. If you can think of anything else." She listened to him because she owed some piece of truth to the system that tried, even imperfectly, to keep people safe. She told him small things: dates, a memory of an argument, the last time she had seen Evan in any context that mattered. She did not tell him about the photograph on Moretti's coffee table. She did not tell him how the room had smelled of cedar when the photograph had been set down. She did not tell him that she had been offered a life in exchange for silence, because silence sometimes had teeth that showed only when you crossed a room and left the lights on. Detective Martinez left with a badge of relief and a promise to call. She knew he'd follow up in his own patient way, the way law does when it is stretched thin. She also knew, with equal clarity, that Moretti's world could not be replaced by police procedure. For people who operated off the books, the mechanisms of the law were inefficient. For her, the law would be a voice that might comfort in hearings and not prevent a man turning up on a stoop. Then Victor escalated. It was a message this time, delivered not by a napkin, but by a small man who waited in the lobby of a boutique hotel and asked a simple question: which is more valuable, her life or her silence? The question came from a man with a mouth that moved unevenly and a bag that smelled of cheap cigarettes. He left her with an ultimatum: money and a name, or else a public scandal that would drag her into the light in a way both repulsive and dangerous. He suggested, in the plain currency he had employed his entire adult life, that more power had to be paid. Victor's people wanted a cut, a recognition that favors and losses required redress. Moretti did not flinch. He considered the offer the way a man considers a bill, with a frown and a quiet counting. They ask a price, he told her later. They wanted to know whether you have been bought or if someone else. And her question was small but sharp. And I refused to perform their economy, he said. I told them that I make other arrangements. He did not add what those arrangements were. He had ceased to add details. It was as if the removal of Evan had become a taboo word no one spoke in full. Victor refused, did not simply go away. He shifted, like a fish changing direction, in deep water. He began to hunt for leverage in ways subtler than ransom old grudges. People who might owe community favors. Men who remembered the kindness of long-lost favors. He left notes that contained hints about a piece of a ledger that was missing. He insinuated that if pressed, he could find a way to make life unpleasant. A leak to a media outlet with a bitter reporter. A story that would paint her as a liar for profit. A rumor that would make her invisible in the worst way. Moretti watched these maneuvers and answered with the cold efficiency of someone who knew the rules of retaliations and reputations. He used his men to intercept whispers and his allies to look for people Victor could use as leverage. He tightened the net in ways that made the city feel both safer and smaller. You could have paid, Julia said one night, thinking in a rush inventory the way you count coins in a jar and realize the jar cannot buy the thing you need. The idea of paying felt like a betrayal. It implied that her safety was a commodity that could be bought for price and then sold. Why not pay and be done? Moretti watched the rain race down the penthouse glass in lines, as if he read maps in the way drops fell. Because paying legitimizes them, he said. It communicates that their market is viable. It doesn't end with money. It ends with more demands. The moral calculus was not neat. To refuse meant escalation. To pay meant you subsidized future predators. Moretti's answer came with the weight of someone used to negotiating graphs of influence rather than moral absolutes. The pressure increased. A small car was broken into on the block where her assistant parked. A rumor flared for a morning about an argument she'd had that a gossip column gleefully misread. None of it was direct violence. But violence need not always be physical to be grievous. It could be a dent in a reputation, a smear on paper, a rumor whispered at a dinner table that made doors close. One evening, Moretti brought her the options again. They sat across from each other in the penthouse kitchen, a room that could be washed in evening light or flood in melancholy depending on the mood. They offered to settle, he said. Not the first time people tried to monetize quiet. Now they want to take a larger piece. Larger? How? She asked. They want to make an example, he said. They want leverage. If they can show that someone who disappeared was valuable, it legitimizes their method. If you are quiet, it's easier for them to say, see, we were owed. If you are loud, they can use your noise as a bargaining chip. She felt the weight of his words sink into the room. The consequences were not just for her. They extended to those around her friends, co-workers, people she'd come to rely upon. Underneath it all was the terrifying realization that the protection Moretti offered drew attention simply by existing. Option A, he said plainly, and listed it like a ledger. Disappear. We prepare you, we provide papers, a new name, a town without history. You live out of sight, you are safe from them, at least materially. But you lose your right to be heard. Option B, she asked. Stay. We prosecute the problem head-on. We do not pay them. We deprive them of profit, and we expose them to their networks. It's messier. It's risky. It makes enemies. And you? What do you prefer? She asked. He did not answer with preference. He answered with reality. I prefer you living a life that looks like the life you want. I prefer you out of fear. But I do not believe in buying peace with predators. It trains them. It creates new markets. The argument was idealistic and practical at once. The city responded as if testing both hypotheses, sometimes with subtle cruelty, sometimes with the dimming hope that more principled responses could exist. She sat in the silence and thought about all the ways she had been asked, her entire life, to minimize herself for men with little regard for the cost. The thought of vanishing into anonymity felt like another kind of silencing. She had been silenced by fear. She had been given a voice by a man whose methods she neither fully understood nor fully endorsed. To give up that voice to anonymous peace felt like agreeing again to be small. "I'll stay," she said again. Not a repetition, but a commitment. "We'll take the risk." Moretti's relief was visible now, like a muscle freed from some tightness. He did not smile in the way the city expected. He allowed himself a tiny exhale. "Then we prepare," he said. "We fortify. We take legal steps where we can. We make it costly for them to push." The months that followed were a war of attrition fought in low lights and legal letters. Moretti used influence subtle pulling strings in City Hall, nudging friendly journalists toward stories of oversight rather than sensationalism, buying silence where it had to be bought in small, targeted ways that were more about public relations than blood money. Detective Martinez kept working, and sometimes his inquiries and Moretti's resources overlapped like two crossing lines on a map. They never collided. Their functions were adjacent, like two lanes of the same road. Victor escalated in fits and starts anonymous packages, a car keyed on a side street, a phone call that was more static than voice. Each action tested Moretti's patience and Julia's resolve. Each action reminded her of the cost. In the midst of it, her relationship with Moretti shifted, too. The tenderness was no longer simply a consolation prize for a life of fear. It had become, in the strangest way, an authentic affection born from proximity and shared defense. She learned his small quirks, the way he read emails with his finger tracing the margin before replying, the way he preferred his coffee black when the world asked for sugar. He learned how to listen when she spoke about past hurts without feeling the need to fix them. Love, when it arrived, was not an epiphany, but a negotiation. She told him one night, as rain hit the windows and patterns her mind had learned to translate into worry, that she did not know whether she could love someone who had erased another person from the map. His face registered nothing and everything at once. He did not deny what she said. "I didn't do that for power," he replied. "I did it because seeing you hurt did something in me. I acted because I could." The words were simple, but not absolving. "You are allowed to hate me for the method, even if you are grateful for the result." She had the urge to walk away then, to test whether her love was tethered to a debt. But walking away would have meant stepping back into a world she had learned could be dangerous. Instead, she said, in a voice that trembled with all the complications of her life, "I don't want to owe you." She stopped, because to say "oh" was to admit the geometry of debt she now lived in. "But I don't pretend to know what I feel." He took her hands, like someone making a bargain, and said, very slowly, "I won't keep score of your debts. I will do what I can to make your life good, at cost to me. If that costs my peace, then payment is due." His honesty felt like a consecration, soundless and bright. Months bled into one another. They built a life in fragments. Dinners in the penthouse, small trips he insisted on that were ordinary enough to be healing, paperwork signed when necessary, quiet concerts they attended under the pretense of business. She learned to leave concealer behind sometimes, to let the small marks of trauma be washed in sunlight and not hidden under foundation. It was progress measured in minutes and hours, rather than a sweeping film. Then the city placed an ultimatum that could not be negotiated with polite replies. One night, a new voice arrived at the door of her penthouse. Not a physical visitor, but a message. A clip from a local news site flashed across her assistant's tablet, showing a previously minor criminal figure, someone with ties to Victor, arrested in another city on unrelated charges. The coverage was quick and crude. Comments appeared like wasps in the cascade of speculation. One user suggested that the disappearance of a local man, Evan Michal, was linked to rich men who took justice into their own hands. Another user posted a blurry photograph of a car and a warehouse and insinuated connections that were purely rumor. It was not violence, but it was a pressure on the narrative, agitation of narrative that made the air in the penthouse feel thinner. Victor, sensing opportunity, escalated again. He used the comment threads like needles, trying to prick holes in Moretti's defenses. He tried to make the story public. He tried to force the ledger into the light where the law might not be kind and gossip would take the place of truth. The toll was not abstract. It came as bill collector's call and as a smear to her name at work by someone who had decided that rumors were truth. It came as a photograph that was altered and posted with her face under a headline that suggested complicity rather than rescue. The people she worked with were tentative. The world that had seemed to warm around her cooled in places where gossip had been unkind. Moretti moved like winter and winter's thaw. He used legal counsel to push back on slander, but he also used less legal tools to shut down smears. He did not enjoy these acts. The administrative labor of countering rumor aided him. He did not like being the kind of man who had to bury things in webs of influence. That truth was Victor, frustrated, tried a different tactic. He offered a public reconciliation for a price. He proposed a deal that, if accepted, would present itself as a benefactor, admitting ignorance and forgiving a debt. He presented it as theater. It was an attempt to rewrite the ledger into something that rescued his image while retrieving profit. Moretti laughed softly when he told Julia. The sound had no mirth. He wants to be big in the papers, he said. He wants to pretend he is magnanimous. And if you refuse? She asked. If I refuse, he will escalate the theater, he said. He will make the story louder. He will look for a way to make it ugly. She felt the choice like a splinter under nail. To accept Victor's offer would be a degradation of all she had survived. To refuse it meant letting a man who had the appetite for chaos play out his hunger. They chose to refuse. The result was a professional and petty war. Victor used networks to send provocations. Moretti used his to contain damage. It did not stop. It stretched on. There were nights when Julia woke with the taste of iron and adrenaline, old ghosts visiting with new manners, but there were other nights. 2 nights when the penthouse hummed with the peace of 2 people who had made a choice together. They would sit and talk of small things. A film they'd like to see. A book she wanted to finish. He would leave notes in her coat pocket telling her not to wear scarlet on Thursday because he liked the way it looked in light. She would set the coffee on his desk when he worked late and find his face softened in a photograph on a mantel where he kept only a few personal things. Their love hardened into something that could shelter but also complicate. It was a love seated in rescue and grown in companionship. It was not They knew that. They were not trying to pretend otherwise. In the end, the decision she made was pragmatic and human. She chose to be with him. Not because she was grateful to be rescued, that was a part of it, but because in the quiet accumulation of kindnesses and shared defenses, she had come to care for the man who had noticed her bruise and chosen to act. I love you, she said one night, when the city outside was a low chorus and the penthouse lights made shadows of the room. The words surprised her by their clarity. They felt true in a way that both terrified and steadied her. He did not react theatrically. He let the words sit in the space between them like a prize, too fragile to toss. Then he took her hands and said, I love you too. The admission carried with it all the problematics of their origin. It was, like everything else they had built together, morally complicated. Love did not absolve the facts of power or the consequences of what had been done in her name. It did not make Evan's absence less real. It did not make Victor any less hungry for leverage. But it did make 2 people who had shared danger commit to one another. They married in a way that pleased no headline and required no overt ritualan arrangement of shared life more than a public parade. They had a small ceremony at a registry office attended by close confidants. An assistant who had become a friend. Detective Martinez as a witness in an official capacity who, quietly and humanely, had come to respect the weird equilibrium other people's choices had created. There was no fanfare. There were promises in the language they understood. Honesty. Refuge. A commitment to try to keep cruelty from the other's life. Victor remained a shadow. He did not vanish. He sent occasional letters that implied an ongoing calculation. Sometimes they were thinly veiled threats. Sometimes they were crude attempts at negotiation. Moretti answered with containment and with pressure on Victor's local channels, making his continued pettiness cost more than it returned. Detective Martinez, who had his own obligations to the letter of the law, watched with the professional unease of a man who tried to stitch order from rumor. He did not always approve, and sometimes he couched his advice in quiet admiration. But he also recognized that people survived by different networks, and his own professional code sometimes required watching how things recalibrated. He looked at the missing person file and at the new life she had chosen, and in his way understood the complexity. Julia did not forgive or forget. She held both the photograph and the memory of fear, with the hands that learned, slowly, to let the small edges dull. She learned to be loved without thinking it a paid commodity. She also learned that love lived in tethering the good and the risky, both bound to what Moretti's resources could deflect but never fully erase. Months rolled into years with the slow abrasion of routine. Victor found less and less to chew on. His people, realizing the price of continuing, moved to other markets. The worst of his pressures faded into a persistent static at the edge of their lives. An occasional rumor, a minor scrape, a paper that needed smoothing. He did not go away entirely, men like him did not, but he was reduced to less than he once had been. The city, in its own way, remembered less sharply than she did. It rearranged its attention. She took a job in Moretti's circle seriously. She made policy memos and scheduled meetings and kept her desk organized. She found in administration a power not measured by fists, but by influence and the slow, steady turn of institutions. And sometimes, in the quiet moments, when the penthouse lights were low and the city breathed in the same measured way they did, she would hold Moretti's hand and wonder at the algebra of their life. She would press her thumb against the small scar on his wrist where, years before, a bad habit of his had left a mark. He would trace the faint bruise on her cheek from long ago with fingertips that trembled less than they had. They did not live in the fantasy of clean justice. They lived in the messy geography of people who had hurt and who had tried to make the hurt stop. They made room for guilt, for gratitude, for love, for responsibility. They made a life in the only way possible, with choices imperfect but intentional. On a rainy Sunday, years into the new arrangement, Julia stood on their penthouse balcony and watched the city wash itself clean. A notification blinked on her phone, another anonymous comment on an old post. She let it go without responding. She kept the photograph of Evan not as an accusation but as a complex bookmark in her life. Sometimes she thought of him with a private sorrow, sometimes with cold distance. She never spoke of the details aloud in the way tabloids might have wanted. She preserved them as the parts of her history that shaped the woman she had become. Victor Kolf remained a dark line at the edge of the map. He continued to exist, but in a lesser capacity than before. The cost of his methods dimmed as alliances shifted and as the market for his kind of violence adjusted. Moretti had paid in ways that were not entirely transparent, and for all the tenderness Julia felt, she could not pretend the ledger was clean. On the night they finally settled into a rhythm that felt durable, whether because habit had become comfort or because the city had let some of its tensions dissolve, she laid her head on his chest and listened to the slow, steady beating there. She realized some truths had been altered. She was no longer the woman who hid bruises beneath concealer and feared the sound of footsteps. She had a life with complexities and obligations, and a man whose hands could both protect and harm. "Did you ever regret it?" she asked him once. After a long silence, he kissed her forehead and said, "Every day, in pieces. And every day, I would do parts of it again." Regret and purpose can sit in the same room. It was the clearest answer she would ever get. It was honest and troubling at once. And in its honesty there was the reason she stayed. Not because rescue had been unblemished, nor because salvation had been simple, but because two flawed people had decided, in a city that did not give many clean options, to make a life together and carry the complexity like a map they refused to fold away. Outside, the city slowed into night. Somewhere, a rumor stirred and died. Detective Martinez continued to file his reports in sober, careful volumes. Victor watched, as men like him continued to watch, for opportunities that dwindled. Evan's name existed in a missing persons file that no longer had the power to undo what had been done. In the arc of lives that had intersected, some debt remained unpaid, some questions unasked. Julia closed her eyes and let the darkness press gently against her lids. She pressed her hand into the hollow of Moretti's palm and felt, for the first time in a long while, ordinary breathing beside her. It was a breathing that contained past and present, guilt and relief, love and 1,000 small compromises. It was a life that would demand vigilance and difficult reconciliations for as long as the city kept its shadows. above the penthouse. The night side, there would be future threats and future reckonings. Victor's name would not disappear from the ledger of their lives, and the moral costs of her safety would linger like a footprint in wet cement. But in that moment, she allowed herself to be present to a warmth that was neither perfect nor false. It was a warmth that had been bought and earned and chosen, messy and real. If you've been drawn into stories that ask what we do when law and power collide, if you want more tales that live in the spaces between rescue and compromise, like and subscribe for more morally complex love stories.